Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse, and the co-prophet of the end times. The topic of today's program is the 11th chapter of the great Old Testament prophet, Daniel. And what we will try to discover is the identities of the last king of the north and the last king of the south. It's my contention that we will discover that the last king of the north is the premier of Russia in these end times, and the last king of the south is the president of the United States. No other biblical scholar has ever correctly identified the last king of the north or king of the south. They usually assume that the last king of the north is either Antiochus Epiphanes or the Antichrist. Neither is correct. The last king of the north is the last great precursor of the Antichrist. Now let's first look at Daniel's numerology, because Daniel made use often of the four great last end times numbers, the numbers 4, 7, 12, and 28. Those numbers signify last events. 4 is the last week in a month. 7 is the last day in a week. 12 is the last month in a year, as well as the last hour in a day, or midnight. And 28 is the last day in a lunar month. It's also a multiple of two other end time numbers, 4 and 7. Daniel also makes use of the very important end time numbers 555, which stand for the rosary, and 666, which is the evil number of the Antichrist. Let's see how Daniel divided up chapter 11 into three sets of 444, 666, and 555. Here on the wall behind me is written out the entire 11th chapter of Daniel. He divided this up into three sets of important end-time numbers. The first 12 verses are divided up into 4, 4, and 4 verses each. The next 18 verses are divided up into sections of 6, 6, 6 verses each. And the last 15 verses are divided up into 5, 5, and 5 verses each. Now let's take a closer look at each of these sections. In the first 4 verses of chapter 11, Daniel mentions 6 ancient kings. The first is Darius the Mede. The next 3 are Darius II, Cambyses, Smerdis, and the great king, which we know as Xerxes. And finally, the greatest of all of them, Alexander the Great. Now in the next 4 verses of chapter 11, Daniel begins his study of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. He mentions in these 4 verses the first 3 kings of the north and the first 3 kings of the south. The first king of the south is Ptolemy Soter. The first king of the north is Seleucus Nicator. The second king of the south is Ptolemy Philadelphus, and the second king of the north is Antiochus Theos. The third king of the south, who Daniel describes as the plant of a bud, is not surely a king until later on, when Daniel does describe him as a king. It's important to understand this, because Daniel does throw out a few false flags. Normally you would say this is not a king, but because he describes him later as a king, then we know that he is a king. The third king of the north is Seleucus Callinicus. Now in the last 4 verses of the first 12 verse set, we meet the fourth king of the south, who is Ptolemy Philopater, and the last king of the north, who is Antiochus the Great. Now in the first 6 verses of the next 18 verses, the fourth king of the north, Antiochus the Great, who is not really the last one, but he's probably the greatest, he continues his exploits. In the next 6 verses, we meet an interesting character Seleucus Philopatou, who would normally be a king. But in verse 20, Daniel writes, "And there shall stand up in his place one most vile and unworthy of kingly honor, and in a few days he shall be destroyed." Thus we cannot count him in our list of kings. The fifth king of the north appears here, and that is Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the last great precursor of the Antichrist in ancient times. And we meet the last king of the south in the next 6 verses, who is Ptolemy Philometor. And thus we conclude the middle 18 verses, which are divided up into a 6-6-6 pattern. This is very important to understand, because not only does it indicate the end times, but it means that we are going to have one more king of the north and king of the south, because we've only had 5 kings of the north and 5 kings of the south. That's why it's important to enumerate them and to understand how many there are. That is how we can eliminate Antiochus Epiphanes as a candidate for the last king of the north, which it is critical for us in these end times to understand exactly who he is. Now, as I said, the last 15 verses of chapter 11 are divided up into a 5-5-5 pattern. The first 5, verses 31 through 35, describe Antiochus Epiphanes, the last great precursor of the Antichrist. And that's why many Bible scholars believe that the last king of the north is Antiochus Epiphanes. But Daniel divides these 15 verses up into a 5-5-5 sequence so that you will understand that there is a break here, that the first 5 verses describe Antiochus Epiphanes, the next 5 verses describe the king of the north, and the last 5 verses describe the Antichrist. Continuing on now with the last 15 verses of chapter 11, we already know that this last king of the north cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, because Daniel set up 6 ancient kings at the beginning, and then he listed 5 kings of the north and 5 kings of the south. That means that there must be a 6th king of the north and a 6th king of the south, and therefore this last king of the north must be different in order to give us 6 kings of the north. Now we will see how Daniel divides the last 15 verses up into a 5-5-5 sequence to make sure that we do not confuse him with the Antichrist who was described in the last 5 verses. Now Daniel verifies this 5-5-5 sequence in a very interesting fashion. The middle verse of each 5-verse sequence, verse number 33, verse number 38, and verse number 43, each of them describe 4 items. Thereby he is separating each of the 5 verses, and thereby indicating that these are 3 separate sections. Now in verse 33, the 4 items he mentions are the sword, fire, captivity, and spoil. Those are the 4 words. In verse 38, the 4 words are gold, silver, precious stones, and things of great price. In verse 43, Daniel writes about treasures, gold, silver, and precious things. All of this numerology is not accidental. It's there so that we can understand that the last king of the north is a very special person, and we must find out who he is. If we are going to survive in these end times, we cannot be caught unaware. The last king of the north is the premier of Russia, and the last king of the south who he defeats is the president of the United States. Now we will continue this discussion of the last king of the north and the last king of the south, as well as a description of the Antichrist, in part 2 on this series on Daniel chapter 11. Now if you would like more information, simply write to the address you see on your screen.